So we are into the parallel sessions. We will have a panel discussion on the economic development with the new mobility. At this room, in parallel, we have a presentation on COVID-19 impact on user perceptions with shared mobilities, and that will be in the Pendleton's room. And so if you have interest, you can go to that room to listen to the presentation on that. So I'm going to introduce the panel. This panel's moderator, Ryan Bach, and Ryan will introduce his panelists. Ryan began working at the Washtenaw community, Washtenaw Area Transportation Studies (WATS) in 2002. Initially focused on travel demand modeling, Ryan has experience in all facets of transportation planning. He has been involved in the development of 4 long-run transportation plans for Washtenaw County. In 2006, Ryan led the effort for a countywide non-motorized plan, which resulted in policy changes and increased focus on multi-modal investment in this area. Ryan served as the chair of Michigan Transportation Planning Association and currently sits on the State of Michigan Transportation Asset Management Council. Ryan became the director for Washtenaw Area Transportation Studies since 2013. Ryan?
Stop. Morning. Can you hear me? Wonderful. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Actually, as I begin to speak, I'll ask the panelists to go ahead and come up and sit next to me. We're, I think, going to be running short on time. But first, let's see, I'm looking for all my panelists. First, I'll ask Sarah Pressbridge-Grunjevich, who's a strategy analyst from May Mobility. There you are, Sarah. Hi. And Amy Lopez, who is the Director of Public Sector Services for INRIX. And Adrian Witt, who's the new mobility practice lead at Tool, and he's actually an engineer, which I didn't realize. I always thought he was a planner. And Komal Doshi, who's the Director of Mobility at Spark. And so just a quick round of applause for all the panelists. And also a shout out to Calvin Tuttle, who helped us put this all together. He was very instrumental in this entire thing. So we're going to be talking about economic strength, modernization of mobility. If you look in the agenda, it's about demystifying mobility, public-private partnerships, which Dr. Blanca talked about, which is a wonderful segue. Big data, how we use that, expanding access. It should be a good discussion. I've got some prepared questions. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions from the audience at the end. But with that, I'll start to my right with Sarah. Tell us about yourself.
Hey, Ryan. My name is Sarah Pressbridge-Grunjevich. I spent several years in public transit within the Annenberg Area Transportation Study and then SMART, and then down into May Mobility, that creates autonomous vehicles. I'm a public transit person who now works in AVs. But I love public transit. But I have the question of if autonomous vehicles are inevitable, how do they optimize our results for our people and our communities and our climate? So talk a lot about that.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Amy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Lopez. I am the Director of Public Sector Services and Smart City for INRIX. Prior to joining INRIX, I had a very convoluted career path and started out mechanical engineering and product design and moved into working for a think tank in DC on electrifying transportation. So I worked with automotive OEMs and utility companies and developed public-private partnerships with cities across the country and getting them to electrify their municipal fleets. My last project before leaving the think tank and moving over to INRIX was working on the DOT Smart City Challenge, which many of you have probably heard of, where I worked closely with Vulcan, and they brought in $10 million to match the $40 million that Columbus ultimately brought to the table. So I have a lot of experience in transportation and mobility, and when NRICS brought me on, they decided that I should be their person to head up their smart cities. So I currently work with a lot of cities across the country, and using NRICS data analytics, we collect data from mobile devices, GPS cars and trucks, and we update that every 60 seconds, make it available in real time through data analytics tools to help cities and MPOs and states optimize their road network, keep people safer, mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and provide more equitable access to transportation. With that, I'll hold off till our questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Komal?
So I'm Komal Doshi, Director of Mobility Programs at Ann Arbor Spark. Spark is the economic development and innovation engine for the Ann Arbor region. We work with startups as well as more mature technology companies, helping them grow and scale within our region. Before this, I was at the University of Michigan. So I was at a think tank program called SMART, which was a joint program between the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute and the Tubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning. So the CCAT conference has been something that I've been attending for a really long time. So I really love coming here and seeing all of these partners that I used to work with and then I continue to work with to really move the needle on connected, seamless transportation systems and improved access.
Great. Well, Brian is correct. I am a civil engineer by background, and I guess my role at Tool Design is twofold. I redesign streets with a sort of a complete street sort of focus, primarily thinking about how do pedestrians, transit, bicyclists move around and access the system. And then the other part of my role is as our new mobility practice lead, and that's working with public, private, and non-profit partners to deliver new mobility services. So that could be anything from how do you regulate e-scooters in the right of way through to permitting and implementing bike share programs all over the country. And just really wanted to say a thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. I think there are massive opportunities for connected and automated vehicles to really change our transportation paradigm, but there's going to have to be a lot of work and collaboration with people that are smarter than me, particularly in this room, around how do those opportunities materialize. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but how do we make sure that we don't lock people out of those opportunities as well? So very excited, and thank you for the
Great. Thanks to all our panelists. Sarah, I'm going to start with you. I am somewhat envious that you have great experience with both large public transportation providers, but also your experience with May Mobility. I think that's fantastic. Gives you somewhat of a unique perspective. You've seen things work, you've seen things fail on both sides, public and private. But when it comes to the success of sort of startups and private sector mobility companies, what are some of the things we should be looking for as signs of success that might lead us to begin to provide public funding and subsidy to sort of enhance our mobility network?
Great question. Thanks. The public sector absolutely needs investment in innovation. There's a lot of things that it does well, but the world is changing fast and it needs to be able to come along with the rest of the world. So I think, particularly for automated vehicles, electric vehicles, it was interesting to see the development of Proterra, kind of EV buses, and starting very small, a few pilots, and now they're selling to transit agencies all over the country. It took a long time, and you start with seed money and small experiments, prove out the technology, and keep building it. And I think we're hopeful at May Mobility to take a similar path of small projects, learnings. Thank you to the federal government for funding for funding innovation and experimentation. But as you develop, it needs to serve real public needs and make a real difference for it to deserve public subsidy.
And so to that point, who gets to decide that? What role should the public sector have in sort of defining the social good or the needs of a service? Is it something that should be completely out of their hands and left to the private sector? How do we bridge that gap? Who gets to decide? And once we start investing those public dollars, what accountability should be had?
I'm truly a technocrat, so I'd love this magical deciding body to make all of the good decisions. But we don't live in that world. We live in a complex world. So I think the public sector absolutely has a huge role. When I was thinking about this, I think it's very helpful for the private sector to have great love and respect for what the public sector is trying to do. There's a lot of smart people in private and public, but a lot of times what the public sector is dealing with they are working on equity. It's not just return on investment and what does an investor and a shareholder need. It's Joseph lives over here and needs to get over here, and he doesn't want to or can't afford a car. That's not something that the market is solving well for a lot of people. Uber has created a lot of mobility. You cannot commute, or at least the average person cannot commute using an Uber. There is a role for buses. There's a role for on-demand mobility solutions that are publicly funded. So the more that the private sector can understand and respect the broader issues, the more they're able to be able to create products that can help everybody. And I do think it's interesting seeing, buses used to be privately provided. You used to be able to make money operating a bus service, but as personal automobiles kind of took over most of the transportation system, the public sector needed to step in. I think the private sector is starting to step in a lot more, and so we're renegotiating the roles of how public and private work together. Ideally, I think the public could help be a convener and kind of that mobility as a service and helping create places where all of these different mobility options can be seen on a platform together and people can access several different mobility choices. But we still have a way to go in that. We can talk more about universal basic mobility and other things. There's some really great experimentations happening.
Thanks, Sarah. Komal, could you tell me a little bit more about Spark in general, Spark's role in sort of transportation, and how your role fits into it? How does that work in terms of modernizing the transportation system here, the region, and beyond?
Yeah, it's my day is really interesting. I get to see startups that are innovative technologies and batteries, drones, autonomous vehicles, robots, skateboards, apps, you name it. I see it all. And so it's really very interesting to help these companies that are being founded by these entrepreneurs who could be a university professor, it could be somebody who has experience in the automotive space, or it could be somebody who just has a passion for mobility and really good with technology. Help them along to grow a company. What does that take, and what are the resources available so that you can actually build something, de-risk it, then gain investment, or find contracts to really scale the technology. So that is one role that Spark plays. It's really supporting the innovation ground up. The other role we play is the convener and really helping projects get a lift off. So, we're talking about public-private partnerships. We're at this interesting junction where we want public and private to work together, but there needs to be somebody else in the middle that can speak both languages, can help each other understand what the needs and the goals are and help them align. And Spark often ends up playing that role as that neutral nonprofit at the table saying, okay, the goals of the public sector are this project or this, the private sector can bring this. How can we align this to meet something that's interesting? So one project that we have ongoing right now, where we have the University of Michigan M-City as part of it. We have May Mobility as a service provider. We have a real estate developer in Prentice 4M. And we have another startup, Important Safety, all coming together with Spark and MEDC as funders to provide on-demand autonomous shuttles within the downtown of Ann Arbor, free to the public to ride. And the goals here are multifold. We want to both understand how the technology can be improved, collecting data to see how it's performing in a multimodal, very dense community. What is the public perception? How can we get people more comfortable being in an on-demand system? How can we encourage a car-light culture? Maybe this is having something like this on demand available to you will help you not use your car as much. Maybe take the transit and use this for your last mile. So there are many goals of this project, but we've taken this on. Spark convened. We're the project grant administrator, and we'll be doing this till the end of October of 2022. So all of you can take a ride. The vehicle actually comes right to the door. So download my mobility app, and you could ride it too.
That's great. Your description of Spark as a convener, I don't think can be overstated. It's wonderful and important. So Amy, turning to you, when I think of INRIX, it's synonymous with data, big data to me. Can you give some examples of how your data is being used in real time and trip planning decisions, but also in long range decisions and the decisions of infrastructure?
So as I said earlier, we do collect data in real time and make that available. We update it every 60 seconds. And we have states across the country that use that data to identify hazardous conditions, dangerous slowdowns, and road optimization, congestion, and bottlenecks. And it's available to TMCs or traffic management centers on a real-time basis. So that's being used operationally. What's really exciting, in my opinion, is that we're coming out with more and more planning solutions. So that data that we create every 60 seconds, we archive it. And that archived data is available through analytics tools that allow us to create actionable insights. So MPOs and cities and states can go into that data and they can mine it for information. For example, it's been used to plan EV infrastructure. Taking our vehicle data and our truck data and knowing where people are coming from and the routes that they're taking and where their destinations are is very important to putting in EV infrastructure that's used versus we think EV infrastructure should go here, because the worst thing for the EV industry is to have unused chargers sitting open. It's bad optics. So making data-driven decisions, not only on charging infrastructure, but also from an intersection performance perspective. So taking our data and looking at how can we reduce control delay or split failure. And split failure, for those of you who don't know, is when you sit at a traffic light for more than one cycle. And that happens a whole lot. 1 second of delay at a traffic light equals 3.9 million barrels of oil every year. 1 second. So with our analytics, cities can go in and they can shave off 1 second or 5 seconds of delay and save millions of barrels of oil and hundreds of thousands of pounds of CO2 emissions, metric tons of CO2 emissions. So that's also really, really important when it comes to planning for infrastructure, planning for signal optimization. And oh, by the way, during COVID and continuing, there have been more traffic fatalities than ever before, and protecting vulnerable road users that are on bikes, that are on peds, people pushing children in carriages and strollers. A lot of those fatalities happen at the intersection or mid-block. So using the data to overlay crash data, to overlay demographic data, because the other unfortunate statistic is that a lot of these vulnerable road users are in low-income communities, and those communities are disproportionately impacted by crashes, by health conditions, by congestion, by pollution, and all of that. So our solutions are going into the hands of the planners that are serving those communities to make them safer, more equitable, and more sustainable.
I think this is a fantastic segue to the question that I have next for Adrian. Touching on equity concerns and how we deal with that, both in urban areas and rural areas. can you speak to the broader issues of equity, but also with some specifics related to a project that you worked on locally a few years ago in the greater Ann Arbor region, looking at people's barriers to jobs, workforce development issues as it relates to transportation systems, micromobility, and things like that?
Yeah. Well, I think first it's a really big topic, and there are whole conferences devoted to that topic. But I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge that, like, the experience of the transportation system is very different depending on your age, your ability, your life experience, maybe your access to opportunity. And really important is at the start of anything that you do, any project, any process that you start, is to really try to identify who are those people that are on the outsides looking in. And some of the ways we can do that is that there are community partners that are working hand in glove with different types of people with different needs all over any given community. And so plugging into those resources and those networks is really important, to be able to listen to folks firsthand and what they actually need, not what we think they need. And some of the things that we have been working, one of the things that at a macro level we like to look at is, where are households most overburdened in terms of their transportation and household costs, and do those sort of match like their income levels? And where those things don't match is where we can start to look at focusing our investments. And that sort of is the segue to the work we did here in Ann Arbor, which was looking at the frequent transit network in the 6-county region around Ann Arbor, in greater Ann Arbor, and looking at what mobility options and opportunities are there to fill some of those gaps, particularly outside of the urban areas. In particular, we were focused on connecting workforce to job opportunities, and a particular segment of the population that's really often overlooked is, we always think about our low income thresholds being like who's below the poverty line, but there is actually a significant amount of people, I think it's something like 30% of people in Michigan, or households in Michigan, are actually employed, but their income doesn't meet their basic household necessities. And so these are folks that are like ready to engage, and like we need to give them opportunities for social upward mobility. And so like looking at some of the barriers that those people face, it's not that they don't want to engage with higher paid, higher jobs and opportunities. It's that they have some limitation that's stopping them from doing that. That could be they're living in a single vehicle household, but that vehicle's needed for taking the kids to school or running errands through the day. And so their job access opportunities without that car might be limited to where they can walk or bike. Or it could be that transit doesn't serve, the out of hours shifts that happen at certain jobs. Yeah, it could be any number of barriers. And I think we have opportunities to put, like, it's our responsibility to look at, like, what are the tools that can go into solving addressing those barriers and really allowing for that upward mobility to happen.
Great. I have to take this opportunity to give thanks to the Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development, who developed something called the Washtenaw County Opportunity Index, originally with the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State, but it's since been moved to U of M, who improved it greatly. Big surprise. So it can be sort of enhanced and spread across and used beyond just Washtenaw County. If you haven't seen anything about it, I definitely encourage you to go to the website, opportunitywashtenaw.org. Thanks, Adrian. Amy, turning back to you, thinking about all the new technologies that have emerged, all the new types of modes that have come online. I mean, the idea of an e-scooter a couple of years ago was just completely, I had no idea what it was until they literally showed up here. And it was quite exciting for a while, and it was very, very fun, actually. But how has the increase in technology and new modes of transportation impacted overall demand? What do you see in the data?
Well, it's interesting. So, the TNC companies kind of stand out in my head because I do a lot of work with New York City DOT, and Uber and Lyft. They can be, it's a love-hate relationship, right? So we all use them. and they're a great service. But they're not exactly providing the service that originally was framed as the ideal, where it's ride sharing and it's multiple people in a car and people that you don't know, and you're all ride sharing and everything is happy and wonderful, and we're taking cars off the road. In New York, it's kind of the opposite. It's especially lower Manhattan, and that's why congestion pricing there is kind of bubbling to the top again. Uber and Lyft tend to create more congestion and more problems getting to the curb, which goes back to that whole equity and access and access to the curb. So it creates issues that have to be solved. Bike, scooter, they're a fantastic option. No emissions and great exercise, a lot of wonderful results from that, but they also have to be managed. So I think using the data from all of these different, it's not a single, silver bullet that's going to fix everything. Like, it's not going to be TNCs, it's not going to be scooters, it's not going to be bike paths. It's going to be a mosaic of solutions that we have to get our arms around in a better way, and we have to use data in a way that we know we're making better decisions. And they're not all going to be perfect from the get-go, but if we can iterate on the decisions and go back and do checkups to make sure that we're using the technology in the way that it should be used, and perhaps there's a new way that creates a better path forward, that's how I see technology unfolding. And I think states and cities and MPOs are all getting very, very good at using data while it's ubiquitous and everywhere, and it's coming at them, through a fire hose sometimes. They don't always know what to do with it. I think there's a lot of new solutions out there, INRICS included, but some other really good solutions that help agencies to ensure that they're using data to make better choices, proper choices.
It reminds me, one of the things that we're responsible for at my agency is the travel demand model, and for the first time, we included essentially a mode of travel that is a car driving by itself. And so that this sort of imbalance of supply and demand, and where do we put that? Do they just drive around or do they park? It's an interesting concept. So thank you, Amy. Thinking more specifically about transit, Komal, I have a question for you. When the pandemic hit, we saw some places had layoffs, ridership dropped, transit agencies were sort of forced to rethink how they did business, and that required innovation to remain successful and move forward. What are the things that you saw that we can sort of learn from that moving forward?
Yeah, I think it was a very unfortunate period, especially for transit. And Ryan, like you said, a lot of people went back to the drawing board. It's like, what's the goal of transit? What are we here to do? And what can technology and data help us understand the need and create solutions that will help us meet this need? Because we have to get people. Not everybody has the luxury of working from home. Many people need to get to their jobs, and many people need to get, use public transit to get to school, to the healthcare appointments, to go get groceries. So how do we kind of focus on that? And so many agencies were able to rethink the paradigm, rethink their KPIs. It's not about how many people we're moving. It's about who needs it the most and are we serving them? Let's get back to that basic. Let's try to think, why is it difficult for people to get or they don't feel safe? So what can we do to do that? Some people went in for microtransit solutions in areas of less density or where they felt that those were better served to get people more quickly to where they needed to be. Some invested in digital ticketing so that or made the buses free so that exchange of cash, which could possibly be a place of concern, is not something that they had to worry about. I think thinking of the organizations that were able to think like that about the problem and address the solution and serve their customer were the ones that were able to come out stronger, still having their community very much in support. In some organizations, the focus really became about maintaining their basic operations and, what all can we cut to have, just keep focus on staying afloat. Well, that's a missed opportunity. And I'm hoping that more transit agencies can really get back to thinking about the goal and the purpose, which is how can we provide access to everyone, especially the ones that have no other means, and provide that in a safe and hopefully sustainable way.
Yeah. And thinking back to something Amy said, knowing there is no silver bullet, Adrian, I have a question for you. We have buses. We have a great bus system here. We might have a scooter that gets dropped off and might sporadically show up somewhere, or local government might define where certain ones need to show up. There might be a bike share. There might be e-bikes. So there's all these little things that can work together that can have some sort of utility for individuals. But I know locally we have sometimes struggled to try to bring that all together. We talk about mobility as a service. How is transportation sort of a subscription? Can you give examples of places that have begun to link those different things together into a system that functions together?
Yeah. It's a complex dynamic that, has a number of layers to it. There's sort of this physical location, bringing together of service so that you can enhance reliability for folks and make sure that people turn up to a place knowing that they have a service, especially if they don't have a vehicle or access to a vehicle. But there's also now, we've layered in technology as well, and so there are complex relationships of how people get access through technology. So things like, do you have a data plan? Do you have a smartphone? Can you actually get on an app? But where those things are starting to exemplify into practical applications is, there are now apps that are bringing together all services under one app. So you used to have to have one for the scooters and one for the transit, one for everything, and now you can do all your trip planning in one. It doesn't mean that they've solved all the problems of for full seamless access. You'd also want to be able to pay for everything in one platform, but maybe they haven't solved that, but at least the first part of the puzzle with the trip planning, you can now look at your trip and say, here are 5 different options, and here's the most efficient one using all the different modes. So that's a good example of where we've gotten to. There's physical mobility hubs that I don't think that concept's really actually that new, but we're sort of reframing it and rephrasing it, bringing it back to life. And that's really just the physical location of bringing services together in a place that's very easy for a user to find them. So there are transportation elements to that. There might be information elements like digital kiosks, Wi-Fi access to do your trip planning. And there could also be, placemaking and commercial opportunities to create those as neighborhood centers as well. So I think that's really a nice dynamic. And then I'd say the last one, going back to our points around underserved and equitable communities, is a lot of mobility services offer discounted programs to access, but they all have different qualification mechanisms sometimes. So there's movement towards, for example, City of Portland's now got a transportation wallet that basically all of those services have one qualification platform. So you can now have access to all of those different services through one qualification process rather than having to go through 4 or 5. So that's where we are right now, and I think there's this sort of ideal in the future that will just have this really seamless process that almost like cable, you could just subscribe for what mobility services you want, pay for that each month, and to be honest, we've got to think about what does the future funding look like. We can't rely on gas tax if we're going to EV, right? So so what does the future of transportation look like? How do we fund it? And it's increasingly becoming user pays, and what does that look like in creating equitable solutions where you can actually look at creating a package that works for your needs and maybe buy that. So that's my sort of utopian future of what I'd like to see.
I like the comparisons to cable and thinking about bundling and unbundling of transportation solutions and future of that. That's good. Yeah. But the idea of talk about the physical locations, but who owns it, who operates it, who profits from it, who benefits from it, are those who do that? Is that the people who should be doing that? It's It's a question that we don't know. I'm agnostic on, but appreciate, going back to Komal's comments of having Spark and someone that can begin to bring those things together. I think is just critical and really nice, and we're fortunate to have that here. Amy, thinking about the changing landscape of American mobility moving forward, I know there's some things that you wish you could say, but you can't. But thinking, what are some new data sets? What's sort of the future of data and how they can affect the transportation planning and infrastructure process moving forward?
Sure. So I think that we're seeing some of this already with, I think safety, equity, and sustainability are the big key factors. It's in the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's billions and billions of dollars that are supporting those three tenets. So I think you're going to see not only from INRIX, but from a whole lot of companies finally focusing following the money, and the money is there. So finally focusing on these big issues. So, and they're all very interconnected. So I think what we're going to see and what we need to see will be more data around vulnerable road users and safety, and overlaying census information, demographic information, speeds, and land use and urban planning. It's all super complicated, and these data sets all exist in different places. But I think what we're going to start to see is the ability to bring all these data sets together in a way that's meaningful, because you can't always just throw them together and figure it out. There has to be context, and you have to contextualize it so that it relates. And that's where I see in our industry, in the data analytics, transportation industry, is moving more towards multimodal, moving more towards focusing on people on bikes and people walking, and more on underserved communities. So I personally think it's super exciting, and look forward to a time when I can tell you more information. Check back in with INRIX in a couple months. So,
excellent. So, Komal, I think the transportation market in itself has been sort of disrupted in many ways. In many ways, it's been a good thing. But, and going back to your role as a convener with Spark, how can public agencies, local governments, regional governments, state governments, public transportation providers best support startups and private companies entering the market? How can we best get out of the way but still sort of retain our role, to Sarah's point earlier, in making sure that we're thinking of the public good as well?
Yeah, and I think I'll echo a lot of what Sarah said. I think the role of the public sector is really to create the right frameworks, the right policies that can support innovation, but that align with the KPIs and the goals that we want to meet around sustainability, around equity, around improved access. Once they have created those frameworks, the private sector can come in and plug in their solution where they can make the most impact. Everyone here knows that the private companies, obviously, they are looking at a return on investment. So for them, it is about oftentimes it could be about the dense market, where there's density, where it'll get used more, which demographic kind of uses their technology more. There are many other driving factors, and even if they want equity to be a big piece of it, it's really hard. They're answerable to their investors. So then the role of the public sector becomes really clear. It is, again, going back to how can we create the right frameworks to encourage these technologies to play well in the space they can, and then where all they can't play, how can either the public sector fill that gap themselves or incentivize these private companies to go that extra mile and provide service in area even if they're underperforming there. The performance metrics is not what's driving their decision making. De-risking technology is, especially with my startups and working in the mobility space, if they're selling to public sector, it's a really hard thing. The investors don't want to touch mobility companies a lot of times that are selling into public sectors, is because the sales cycle is so large. So by having the opportunity to do pilots, small duration, term limited projects that, again, capture the right KPI, can demonstrate that the technology works and the partnership works, can go a long way for both sides. It can prove to the public sector that this innovative way of doing things can really work for our organization, and maybe this is something we can get into long-term contracts with. But for the startups that are doing this, it's a real validation of their technology and the partnership and the funding model that they are trying to pitch for. So I think there's a supportive role that both sides can play for each other to kind of take this mobility revolution forward.
Thanks, Komal. Sarah, I've known you for a while. I know you to be a parent, and I'm curious to get your insights or thoughts about AVs and their effect on you, your family, and what you think the impact of them is going to be on your children ultimately.
It's a good question. I think about it a lot. I talked about how I'm a public transit person. My confession is I own 3 cars. And I wonder if my children will have the same choices. I am native to Ann Arbor, but I'm a very happy Detroiter. I live in kind of a traditional neighborhood, but Detroit is a city that sprawls, and the rest of southeastern Michigan follows kind of a similar land use pattern. It's really hard to live here without a car and to have that good life. But my oldest is going to be 16, and I counted it 6.5 years. So I have a little time. But, where I want him to go to high school, I think he could probably bike or walk, but I'm not sure it's that safe given the sidewalk infrastructure and the cold winter, etc. But I think I want to try that and to see if he can, how well can he live his life without having to have a personal automobile. And we'll see how that goes. But I think as he goes to college and chooses places to live, I'm hoping that there are places that are oriented to him being able to walk, bike, take an automated vehicle, take transit, and it's not a radical lifestyle choice to live without a car. I'm not sure if it'll be his lifetime, my younger children, or maybe their children, but I think they will live differently than I do. But kind of what my choices are today, I can't do it. I hope they can.
So, Amy, a last formal question for you. In terms of these new transportation options, new technology, new supply of transportation, what would it take, speaking a lot to what Sarah was just getting at, what would it take to move the majority of Americans away from the idea of the dream being to own their own vehicle, and move to sort of a subscription or mobility as a service, and actually having that be a lot more normal and a lot more common?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question, right? That's a tough question. So my child is a little older than yours. She's 27. And I think about how things have changed just in her lifetime. And I think that the generation of new drivers are more thoughtful in the world around them, and they give more consideration to the environment, and they give more consideration to underserved communities, and more consideration to their own privilege, which I think is key to changing our culture, because it's a culture. It's hard to, and I worked for years in the EV world of trying to change hearts and minds to get people out of an internal combustion engine and into an EV. 15 years ago, we started that. Finally, we have some people driving EVs, and not really all that much of a critical mass. So it's going to have to take a culture shift. And I think it will be about the technology, but it's really going to be about how much we care about everything. I know it's very, kind of a soft answer, but I really think it's hearts and minds, and it's the generations that are coming up that actually really are insightful to and more in tune to their communities that they live in and the communities of the planet versus just, my next door neighbor or just their own myopic worldview.
Altruism has a role to play in the future of mobility. That's great. Adrian, thinking back to those ownership models, who owns, who operates, who benefits, what are some sort of lessons learned that you've seen with how public and private sectors have worked together? What can we sort of gain from that?
I feel like I might be repeating some previous answers, but I think the biggest thing that's changed, especially in the new mobility sectors, is different agencies and the private sector. They're understanding what their roles are. They're like, there's a clearer definition of, this is what we can do in this space, and this is what we should be doing in this space. And I'll give you sort of an example. When bike sharing first started, it's less than 10 years old, so it's very new. And at the time, there was this like, where does it live kind of question. And the private sector wasn't quite there, didn't really know what it was, and hadn't really adapted to it. They were providing vehicles, but not necessarily a service. And so public agencies stepped into that, similar to what Sarah was talking about with how buses kind of changed their operating model. Now they're realizing that, that the private sector is plugged into e-scooters and bike share, and there are opportunities there for a better role for public agencies to be more about managing the right of way, protecting public safety, and utilizing these services for the benefits that they can provide to the citizenry. And meanwhile, the private sector is, continuously adapting and changing their product development as well to respond to the needs of those users in their cities. Like, we've got sit-down scooters now. You don't have to stand up. So things like that are happening. And then I think on the funding side, there's also opportunity there, and we're already starting to see it. New federal bills around EV bikes and vehicles and charging infrastructure that can help sort of move some of these mobility options forward, such as EV car sharing. And then I guess, to that end is also, we're also seeing transit agencies, and I think this is a bit of a repeat, like transit agencies, because of the pandemic, have really thought about, well, what is our role? And, there is a ridership cliff that will probably take a little while to rebound from. People are worried about sharing enclosed spaces with other people. And so there are these new mobility options that allow you to get out of vehicle. Maybe it's on the scooter, on the bike, share your own, like have a shared vehicle that you can use from time to time. And we're working with a lot of, especially small to mid-size transit agencies that are starting to think about how they make decisions about what's their role in delivering those services. That doesn't mean they're going to go operate them, but they're now starting to think about how does that help us with our delivery of service to the public. So I think those are some of the changes that I'm really excited about.
Thanks, Adrian. So I've got one last question for all the panelists. I'll start with Sarah. But in 30 years, do you think the majority of Americans will own or have access to their own private vehicle?
Fantastic question. I think it all depends on how expensive it is, and can you afford personal mobility, and what kind of mandates, etc. How much technology do you have to have in a car? My confession is my favorite car to drive is my stick shift, and the only feature it has is automatic locks. So I'm apparently I like my freedom. So if there continue to be inexpensive personal automobiles, I think they will still be very widely used. If they're expensive, then we'll see increasing sharing.
Will your car be around in 30 years?
No, it's dying right now.
Amy?
Oh, that's such a tough question. We have such a passionate love affair with the U.S., in the U.S. with automobiles, and, we're in the heartland of cars here. And as a person who grew up, racing muscle cars, I can't imagine not having my own personal car. And we do equate it to freedom. And I think we just need to flip that equation to, there's freedom in other ways and other modes. I think it's going to be a long time before we don't have personal cars. But maybe I also have 3 cars. Just a shame to admit that we own 3 vehicles. I think we're going to get away from, one family with 3 adults having 3, actually with 3 adults having 4 vehicles. I think we will see that change. And hopefully it will become more affordable at the same time, though, because we do want to have access to those that need it in more rural areas that right now don't have the options, and that those options will need to evolve in the next 30 years.
Great. Kamal?
Well, I think I'm more hopeful. I think yes, probably not. I would say it's a car light future. That it's ownership is really light. We're really up the ante on all the other modes, and when we do that, the car becomes an option for occasional trips when we really want to experience what driving felt like. And then you can take the car out for a spin. Back in my day, that love to drive this vehicle. But yeah, I'm very hopeful that it's going to be a car light future with exceedingly access to many other modes that allow us to have maybe even more freedom than we have right now to get around.
I like driving as temporal tourism in the future. That's interesting. And Adrian?
Yeah, I guess for me, when I first heard the term autonomous vehicle, my mind went immediately to this place in the future where there's just these vehicles going around that on demand you can just call one up and get anywhere you need to go, which would lead to saying we won't have private vehicle ownership, but for all the points that these folks have raised, is that that's not how we enjoy our autos right now. So think about your own car and your personalized experience in there. You got your music, you got all your setup, and it's comfortable. Getting in a new car every time that's not something that people will adjust to quickly. So I think there's this cultural piece, but there's also we've got to think about where the development of the technology is coming from, and a lot of that is private sector that quite frankly, will they want to mandate my future where I see this are they going to want to have procurement rules around you got to bid for the right to operate service in this community. That's not the way stuff is delivered here at the moment, and I can't see it being that way in the future. So I would unfortunately be on the pessimistic side of that question.
Well, I think we've successfully eaten up all the time for audience participation. And to keep us on schedule, unless there's any pressing questions, I think we'll move forward. This was a great conversation, and another thanks to all the panelists here, Sarah, Amy, Kamal, and Adrian. It was a great conversation. Thanks, everyone.